By the way, he does a ton of that in this story. I looked up a few things. Like there were a couple of details. I thought it ended kind of abruptly, and there was some loose ends I didn't think he tied up very well. So I went hunting to find what the answers were. Like, for instance, who's going to be the next Pendragon?
Right.
We hear that Ransom's going to hand it off tonight. That's what Denniston says.
Yeah, you're right. And
Ransom's going to hand it off tonight. We don't even hear about that. Or when Merlin says, I see sitting beside me is one of the last of the 7 bears of Logres, looking at Mr. Bultitude. What is that? What is he referring to?
Mr. Bultitude anyway. I'm so confused by him.
Mr. Bultitude is the last of the 7 bears of Logres.
Sweet.
There is no such thing as that. I looked it up. Lewis made it up in a letter.
They were creating a mythology for England, and they were borrowing from Celtic legends and Arthurian legends and all those sorts of things in order to do it and give it verisimilitude, right?
Yeah.
Legends that we recognize? What's that?
No, there's no bears.
It's not a real legend, though. He even made up the legend. No, that's what I mean. He's weaving together things from legend and pure myth, right, in order to create this British mythology. And what I was going to say is I was reading the discussion board posts of some of the kids from the British discussion class for our online academy today. And we had asked them to introduce themselves briefly and give us the title of their first book. And I would say roughly half of them said The Lord of the Rings was their favorite series of books. And they were talking about the Silmarillion, and one of the students said, that it's a work of history. And I thought, well, it's written in the style of a history, but he made it up, right? It's not actually nonfiction here. And I just loved it because these guys got together very intentionally, along with the other Inklings, with a purpose, a stated purpose amongst them, to create a national mythology. And guys, they did it.
And that people would buy, that students would buy without thinking later.
Absolutely. And this is a part of it. This series we just wrote was participating in that challenge to create that thing. And it remains to the present day.
So that probably, and by the way, it's 42 minutes after the hour. So we have another session though, don't we, Emily?
Yeah, in 2 weeks we get to talk about the whole thing.
Okay, so this isn't the last time we get to talk about this, but I think we should, since based on what you just said, Missy, I think we should spend a minute talking about the Logres Britain struggle that he sort of elucidates and explains in the very last chapter, so that we know where this whole thing was going all along. Because Logres, the mythical legendary tradition of which Merlin is a representative, of which King Arthur was a representative, of which Mr. Bultitude and Ransom and Jane are representatives, stands over and against Britain, and they're in eternal, constant struggle. What does Lewis mean by that? What are those two things, Logres and Britain, and what are they symbolic of?
I thought it was interesting that he differentiates between kings and politics and Logres, right? That the king is not necessarily the head of Logres, that they might not have anything to do with one another. In fact, they don't, according to him.
I also loved 368. He expounds on this idea, the difference between Logres and Britain, but it's not just Logres and Britain, that he doesn't make 2 blades of grass the same, how much less 2 saints, 2 nations, 2 angels.
Yeah.
The feeling Tellus depends on nursing that little spark, on incarnating that ghost, which is still alive in every people and different in each. When Logres really dominates Britain, when the goddess reason, the divine clearness, is really enthroned in France, when the order of heaven is really followed in China, why then it will be spring. I thought that was so cool. I mean, that each nation has this thing, this essence at their heart.
And that's Lewis at his best.
Reason destroyed France, but if whatever that is truly reigned in France, then it would be spring.
It's such a great idea. Basically what it is it welcomes the differences among all people and says there is something that unites us that can be expressed in our cultural differences that is in every country at war with a corrupted version, at war with a darkened version of itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it has a British look, it has a French look, it has a Chinese look. And Lewis is saying in the most general way possible, let's all fight for the good version. And then given what we've been talking about so far, the good version has to do with spiritual reality. It has to do with God. It has to do with Christianity, which if it's anything is cross-cultural.
But
I just think it's a beautiful way to put
different. I love
Yeah.
the idea that virtue, the grammar of virtue, is this idea of standardized goodness, but that's just the grammar. That then it flowers and looks different everywhere you go.
And how could it not look different in China and in France than in England? I just think it's a powerful idea. It
It
really
reminds
is.
me of the lecture you gave on seeds and flowers at the
Yeah.
several years back. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It really does partake of that idea. But this also resonates with what we watched occur in the room with Mark that we talked about earlier in the discussion today.
Mm.
It's like that on a macrocosm. What happened with Mark in the room where everything was slightly off and he came to a crossroads and realized that if he continued on the straight, there would be a cross, there would be a suffering, that it's a war between good and evil going on, even as the book pictures it. And in that microcosm is, I think, expanded to include the world in this section that you're referencing with all the different nationalities who have been perverted and twisted as they followed after those evil, perverse things that were off in one way or another. But that there's something that's written on the heart of nature that is resonant with Merlin, right? And Logres in England, and it would go by some other name in those other names.
Right.
But
right.
that at the heart of nature, written on its hard drive, if it were allowed to flower properly, it would be the good.
It would be the good, yeah. And it is as consistent culture to culture as it is unique from culture to culture.
The question is how? How does that natural thing, that natural law, maybe we should say, that's written on the hard drive of Logres, come to dominate or to overtake the bent and the perverse and the wicked? Because that's going to be where his thematic ideas lie, right?
Well, yeah, but in this story, that it's really clear how that happens is war in the heavenlies, to use a biblical terminology. How that happens is that the descent of the gods is necessary. It's necessary for the bad guys to inadvertently bring down deep heaven on their own heads. Mm-hmm. That this is a kind of war that can't be won with pamphlets. It has to be won by Merlin getting what's the word, possessed or embodied by supernatural forces. I love the way he does that. He's flights of intellectual fancy fill the novel from beginning to end, but in the end, he humbly says, "God help us."
Mm-hmm.